Chapter 1895. He waved his hand at the crowd and spoke in a very gentle manner. The crowd immediately responded in agreement when they heard him. Perhaps it was because the commotion was too big that the officials in charge of this piece of land came over. They trembled as they knelt on the ground and shouted. Their faces were filled with surprise and worry. They called for people to spread out a red carpet on the muddy ground. But it was also true. How would the officials who were assigned here have the chance to see the 9th Emperors and the 9th Imperial Concubine? They probably didn't expect such honorable people like the 9th Emperors and the 9th Imperial Concubine to come here. Xiao Chun shook his head helplessly. They were here to relax. How could this be considered relaxing? Xiao Chun waved his hand at Third Xing. Third Xing went forward and emphasized to the crowd that the 9th Emperors and the 9th Imperial Concubine were here to relax. He asked them to ignore them and not disturb them. Third Xing spoke for a long time before the crowd dispersed. The official also understood Xiao Chun and Jingyu's intentions and calmed down. When he heard that the 9th Imperial Concubine wanted to eat the taro, he immediately asked someone to bring over 2 big baskets of taro. Jingyu was very satisfied with 1 basket of taro and the other basket of taro. That's thoughtful of you. Jingyu nodded slightly at the official. Instantly, the official was overwhelmed by the favor and knelt down, saying that it was only right. The people in the field couldn't ignore the existence of Xiao Chun and Jingyu. The gazes of the ladies secretly looked at them were scorching, filled with worship and envy. All kinds of strange gazes and secret words made Jingyu silently lower her head. Let's go back. Jingyu felt very uncomfortable being stared at like this. After walking for a short distance, she said this. Xiao Chun nodded slowly. Jingyu's pair of golden-green eyes were really eye-catching. Now that everyone was looking at them, they could instantly distinguish the identities of Xiao Chun and Jingyu. How could they continue to stay here peacefully? Xiao Chun roughly understood Jingyu's intentions and didn't stay here for long. He walked back the way he came. What's wrong? Xiao Chun looked at Jingyu, who sat in the carriage with her head lowered. He raised his eyebrows and asked, Is it because of what happened just now? No. Jingyu shook her head. After a moment of silence, she suddenly turned to Xiao Chun and asked, Xiao Chun, what if I suddenly disappeared? Xiao Chun's expression suddenly changed. He reached out and grabbed Jingyu's hand. His pitch-black eyes were filled with a deep and frightening darkness. He stared at Jingyu and asked, What's wrong? Why did you suddenly say something like this? Jingyu lowered her head in vexation. Just as she was thinking about what to say, Xiao Chun suddenly reached out and pulled Jingyu into his embrace. His arms tightened, and those deep and familiar words rang in Jingyu's ears. You can't leave me. Those firm words rang in Jingyu's ears. I won't allow it. Jingyu's heart trembled violently. She suddenly felt a sharp pain in her heart. I won't let you go. You can't be so heartless. Xiao Chun could also feel the uneasiness in Jingyu's heart. In fact, he felt it even more deeply than Jingyu. Xiao Chun didn't dare to think about it. He didn't dare to say it. However, after hearing Jingyu's question today, Xiao Chun could clearly feel the suffocating feeling. He didn't dare to think about it. He didn't dare to think about it at all. Chapter 1896. Xiao Chun. Jingyu hugged Xiao Chun and said with a deep sigh, How could I bear to leave you? If everything was as Jingyu thought, perhaps, even if she couldn't bear to, she would. Jingyu closed her eyes abruptly. Her heart was filled with bitterness and sorrow. She only hoped that everything was just her own conjecture and hallucination. The journey back became inexplicably heavy. Jingyu forced herself to stay alert. When they returned to the house, the atmosphere was much more relaxed. There weren't any delicacies in the house, but the light dishes were more to Jingyu's liking. After lunch, Jingyu lay down outside the courtyard, leaning on Xiao Chun. She held a book in her hand and read. She didn't know why, but she became absent-minded as she read. Her gaze landed on the leaves in the distance. Looking at the drifting leaves, swaying in the wind, listening to the rustling sounds, everything was so peaceful. Jingyu's impetuous heart gradually calmed down. She raised her hand slightly and placed it on her belly. His eyes were calm and gentle. Jingyu was lost in thought as she looked at the leaves in the distance. Suddenly, she felt something covering her hand. Jingyu was stunned. When she lowered her head, she saw Xiao Qin's large hand covering her small hand. Jingyu tilted her head slightly. Xiao Qin reached out and pulled Jingyu into his arms, hugging her tightly. It was clearly such an action, but for some reason, Jingyu suddenly felt like crying. This was the emotion of a pregnant woman. It was really hard to control. Dinner was finished early. Xiao Qin held Jingyu's hand and walked unhurriedly in the forest, speaking very gently. Behind them, Xing San followed from a distance. When Jingyu saw the forest, she was reminded of Xiao Qin's appearance. If Hellion Theo hadn't brought her here, she wouldn't have known that the monster-like person was actually Xiao Qin. Why didn't you run away then? When Xiao Qin heard this, the corners of his mouth curled up slightly. He looked at Jingyu and asked with a smile, "What are you talking about?" "I wanted to run away." Jingyu looked up at Xiao Qin and said, "But more than that, I was curious. I was curious as to why the great ninth emperors would be like this. Moreover, no one was chasing me, so why would I run away alone?" Jingyu's answer was the same as before. Xiao Qin couldn't help but laugh when he heard this. Come to think of it, this was the reason why he liked Jingyu. She was so different from the masses. How could he not love such a woman? The scenery around them was no longer the same as before. The vegetation had covered this place, and the sky was gradually darkening. Jingyu and Xiao Qin turned around and walked back to the house. Just like that, a day passed peacefully. On the second day, Xiao Qin brought Jingyu to another place, the mountain landscape fruit grove. They had been walking around here for the past few days. Jingyu suddenly didn't want to go back. She had stayed here for 10 days. Looking at the scenery outside, Jingyu was very absent-minded. She really wanted to stay like this with Xiao Qin until Xiao Bai sent a letter saying that Xing, Yi, and Su Yu were about to get married. Something had happened in the palace, and he wanted Xiao Qin and Jingyu to return quickly. What happened? Jingyu frowned slightly. Something happened. Xiao Qin slowly put away the letter in his hand. He frowned and said in a deep voice, "Beauty Wong was sentenced to death." Chapter 1897. What? Jingyu froze when she heard this. She looked at Xiao Qin with a frown and asked, "Beauty Wong is dead? So what if a concubine is dead?" It was the empress who ordered her death. Xiao Qin pursed his lips and said, "There were a few other harem girls who were ordered to die as well." What? This time, it was Jingyu's turn to be shocked. Why did Lu Miaoqiu suddenly start a killing spree? Pack up and return to the residence immediately. Xiao Qin turned his head and instructed the people outside the door. Then he stood up and looked at Jingyu and said, "The letter didn't say what exactly happened, but the empress is in danger right now. The rumors in the court are that the empress dominates the harem. The empress doesn't have any influence from her mother's family. Beauty Wong's father is an important official in the court, but he is a scholar. If it was a general, then it would be fine. But for a scholar, you should know how terrifying his mouth is. Xiao Bai might not be able to deal with this matter. However, I don't know what the emperor's attitude is. We have to go back." Xiao Qin's words were full of seriousness. Jingyu's expression quickly changed, and she frowned. Okay. She nodded and agreed. On the way back, she was still a little anxious. Xiao Qin was right. Lu Miaoqiu didn't have any influence in the imperial city. If Xiao Yuling didn't dote on Lu Miaoqiu, the women in the harem would definitely be ruthless towards Lu Miaoqiu. Now that Lu Miaoqiu was pregnant, it was even more dangerous. Xiao Yuling, don't disappoint me." Jingyu frowned deeply. Her golden-green eyes flickered with a very deep light. The journey back was still a little long, but Jingyu's stomach couldn't withstand the bumps, so the carriage's speed also slowed down. By the time they returned to the residence, it was already night. "You are rest well. Don't worry. I'm here for you." Xiao Qin left these words and went into the palace that very night. Jingyu didn't say a word, but Jingyu knew that Xiao Qin must have his own idea. Nothing must happen to Lu Miaoqiu. After Jingyu returned to the Wang mansion, she called for Yin Xiao and asked her about Lu Miaoqiu. "You're saying that Beauty Wong offended the empress and the empress ordered her to die in a fit of anger. Anyone who pleaded for mercy was ordered to die. Yin Xiao knew that Jingyu wanted to ask about the empress after hearing Jingyu's question. The empress isn't such an unreasonable person. Was she really sentenced to death because she offended the empress? Jingyu frowned deeply and asked doubtfully. This servant doesn't know. Yin Xiao furrowed her brows in confusion. She tightly pursed her lips and said, this servant also heard from the people outside that the emperor stayed overnight in Wang Marin's palace. The empress was jealous of Beauty Wang, so she found an excuse to kill Beauty Wang. Yin Xiao looked at Jingyu and said, these are all rumors outside. Right now, everyone is saying that the empress became arrogant because of the emperor's favor and ordered the death of the emperor's favorite concubine. Also, many people are reporting to the emperor that they want to abolish the empress. After Yin Xiao finished speaking, she carefully looked at Jingyu's expression. Bastard. Jingyu was silent for a moment. Suddenly, she slammed her hand on the table. Yin Xiao was so shocked that she quickly knelt down. Her eyes were filled with fear as she said in a trembling voice, Madam, please forgive me. Chapter 1898. This servant shouldn't have listened to the gossip outside and talk about the empress. Yin Xiao carefully looked at Jingyu and said, forget it. Jingyu waved her hand slightly with a headache and said, you may leave. Yes. Yin Xiao bowed and left. Jingyu sat in her seat with her brows tightly furrowed. Her heart was filled with anxiety, and she wanted to rush to the palace immediately. However, looking at her big belly, she gave up on this thought and silently chose to wait for Xiao Chun to return. However, after waiting for a long time and not seeing Xiao Chun return, Jingyu furrowed her brows tightly. Later on, she didn't know how, but she fell asleep. When she woke up in the morning, she saw Xiao Chun beside her with his eyes tightly shut. She didn't know when Xiao Chun came back. He must have fallen asleep not long ago. Jingyu was silent for a moment and waited quietly without waking Xiao Chun. After a while, Xiao Chun slowly woke up. The empress is fine. Don't worry. Xiao Chun was clearly very tired. After saying this to Jingyu, he hugged Jingyu again and was about to fall asleep. Jingyu wanted to ask about the situation in the palace, but seeing Xiao Chun's drowsy appearance, she didn't ask. Amen. Sleep for a while more. Jingyu got up and said to Xiao Chun, Amen. Xiao Chun let go. When Jingyu got up, Xiao Chun fell asleep again. Madam. Yin Xiao saw Jingyu get up and hurriedly bowed. Xiao Chun is still sleeping. Be quiet and don't disturb him. Jingyu gestured to the maids to keep quiet. The maids hurriedly complied. Seeing Jingyu like this, a faint smile appeared in their eyes. The relationship between Madame and the 9 emperors was really good. Jingyu arched her eyebrows slightly. She tidied up a little in the outer room and said, Go and call His Highness over. I have something to ask him. Yes. Yin Xiao acknowledged and left. Jingyu sat for a while before she saw Xiao Bai. She had only left for about 10 days, and so many things had happened in the imperial city. It was really worrying. Mother. Just as Jingyu was drinking from her cup, she saw Xiao Bai's figure walking over. Come, have a seat. Jingyu waved at Xiao Bai. She didn't know if it was just her imagination, but she felt that Xiao Bai seemed to be much more mature this time. Seeing this, Jingyu secretly nodded. Xiao Bai sat down and took a sip of tea, then looked at Jingyu and asked, Mother, why are you looking for your child? What happened in the imperial palace in the past few days? Tell me about it. Jingyu didn't beat around the bush and looked at Xiao Bai. Mother, you should have heard about this matter. Xiao Bai instantly understood. He knew that Jingyu was concerned about the empress. He immediately sat up straight and said, Everyone outside is saying that the empress killed the concubines in the imperial harem out of jealousy. And the father of this concubine was coincidentally a third-rank official in the imperial court. He has an important position in the imperial court. When he heard that his daughter was sentenced to death, he immediately knelt in the main hall and reprimanded the emperor for favoring the empress. He brought out the etiquette of the 24 filial piety. In the end, he even persuaded the other officials to speak up and force the emperor to abolish the empress. Xiaobai slowly said, "The imperial court is in chaos. There is also a great disturbance in the imperial harem. The concubines who were previously suppressed by the empress are all kneeling in front of the palace gates." Chapter 1899. There were even a few harem candidates who intentionally blocked the path that the empress often took. In a fit of anger, the empress sentenced all of them to death. If this was in the past, it wouldn't be a big deal to sentence harem candidates to death. But at this delicate moment, not only did the empress not exercise self-discipline, she went from bad to worse and angered everyone. Now, the palace is in chaos. The emperor can only care about the court, but not the harem. There are cries all day long. Some people want to commit suicide, and some don't want to live anymore. I really can't do anything about it, so I sent a letter to father to ask him to come back. Xiaobai said helplessly. Miaoqiu wouldn't have sentenced Beauty Wang to death for no reason. There must be some inside story. Jingyu frowned fiercely, listening to Xiaobai's words. Why did Jingyu feel that they were linked? There is indeed a problem. Jingyu just finished speaking when she heard a low voice coming from the room. Jingyu was stunned. When she turned her head, she saw Xiao Chun walking out. "Xiao Chun, you're awake." Jingyu saw Xiao Chun come out and was slightly surprised. She then reached out to pour a cup of tea for Xiao Chun. Yes, Xiao Chun had just woken up, so there was a faint nasal sound in his voice. Right now, the situation in the palace is very chaotic. If I'm not wrong, this series of events was secretly manipulated by someone. The purpose is to pull the empress down from her position. As for who did it, I think the empress knows very well. What do you mean? Jingyu was stunned when she heard this. There was a faint look of astonishment in her eyes. She then looked at Xiao Chun in astonishment and said, "Miaoqiu already knew about this? So the current situation is within reason." "That's just my guess." Xiao Chun faintly raised his eyebrows and said, "What happens in the harem is between you women. Last night, I went to the imperial palace and expressed my attitude. I also know Xiao Yuling's attitude. I only know that it is to stabilize the situation. As for the empress's attitude and what exactly is going on, perhaps you should go and ask her yourself." Xiao Chun looked calmly at Jingyu. Jingyu raised her eyebrows when she heard this. She thought for a moment and looked at Xiao Chun with a faint smile in her eyes. "I was thinking of going into the palace to take a look and give these people a warning. The empress doesn't have a maternal family, so this imperial concubine is from her clan." Jingyu coldly snorted and turned to give orders. "I'll have a maidservant enter the palace with you." Xiao Chun frowned slightly and said, "You are pregnant now, and it is inconvenient for you to move around. You can use the people I gave you. After all, you are going to the harem. It is not appropriate for 15 Xing to follow you." "Okay." Jingyu faintly raised her eyebrows. She knew that the person Xiao Chun gave her must be powerful and easy to order around. Jingyu knew that entering the palace this time was not so simple. Naturally, she did not open her mouth to refuse. "You don't have to be too anxious." Xiao Chun held a cup of tea and looked at Jingyu. Shangguan Linglan brought the entire general's residence to suppress them. These people don't dare to mess around. Although the mouth of a scholar is infuriating, Shangguan Linglan is a barbarian who is not afraid of anything. He is indeed arrogant. Jingyu heard Xiao Chen's evaluation of Shangguan Linglan and immediately laughed out loud. Chapter 1900. Xiao Chen's evaluation was really amazing. Jingyu could also imagine how Shangguan Linglan protected Lu Miaoqiu. The words of the great general's residence and the Jingyuan residence held some weight. Moreover, there was the imperial residence behind them. It was just that Jingyu had not returned, and the imperial residence did not express their stance properly. Now that Jingyu had returned, it was time to settle this matter properly. Jingyu faintly raised her eyebrows. After waiting for a while, she saw a person dressed like a spring walking steadily into the room. She respectfully knelt beside Jingyu and said, "Greetings to Madam." Jingyu slowly nodded. She looked at the servant girl in front of her and asked, "What is your name?" "I am a disciplinary guard, ranked 14th. Today, I have been ordered by my master to serve Madam. May Madam bestow me a name." Xing Shirsi respectfully bowed. 14. Jingyu was surprised. She originally thought that the disciplinary guards were all men. She did not expect that there would be a woman. Your name is pretty good. There is no need to change it. You will be called Shirsi. Jingyu slowly nodded and said, Thank you, madam. Xing Shirsi clearly heaved a sigh of relief. Jingyu did not bestow a name because she was telling Xing Shirsi that she could still return to the disciplinary guards after completing her mission. She was instantly relieved. Madam, the carriage is ready. Jingyu raised her hand to let Xing Shirsi rise. After hearing Yin Xiao's voice, she nodded slightly and replied, All right, let us enter the palace. Yes. Yin Xiao and Xing Shirsi replied at the same time. Jingyu led the two of them into the palace. Looking at the guards at the entrance of the palace, Jingyu instantly narrowed her eyes. The palace was getting more and more restless. With this thought in mind, Jingyu lowered the curtain of the carriage. The privilege of the imperial residence was to drive a carriage into the palace. This was the privilege of the 9th emperors and the 9th imperial concubine. Jingyu sat in the carriage and supported her chin with her hand. She walked in the palace and headed straight for the empress's sleeping quarters. As soon as she entered the palace, she heard Lu Miaoqiu's angry shout. Jingyu looked at the palace maids kneeling on the ground, raised her brows slightly, and asked with a smile, What happened to your highness the empress? Why are you so angry? It's you. Lu Miaoqiu paused for a moment, and her eyes lit up when she saw that it was Jingyu. You may leave. Jingyu walked in and waved her hand to signal the palace maids to leave. The group of palace maids cautiously looked up at Lu Miaoqiu. Get lost! Lu Miaoqiu shouted angrily. The group of palace maids immediately responded, We will leave. After the group of palace maids left, Jingyu walked towards Lu Miaoqiu. She looked at Lu Miaoqiu, who was sitting there angrily, and asked helplessly, What happened? Why are you so angry? What else could it be? Lu Miaoqiu sighed deeply and raised her hand to rub her head as she said, Now that the palace is filled with a foul atmosphere, the palace maids and servants still don't let people have peace of mind. Really? Lu Miaoqiu's words were filled with helplessness. Jingyu laughed when she heard this. Hey, you can still laugh. Lu Miaoqiu looked at Jingyu's smile, and her face immediately turned stiff. Miaoqiu, are you angry with me? Jingyu's eyes were full of smiles. She stood up and sat beside Lu Miaoqiu and reached out to hold Lu Miaoqiu's hand. Chapter 1901. I know I came back late, but Jingyu looked at Lu Miaoqiu with a smile and said, Isn't this the situation you wanted to see? I don't know what you're talking about. Lu Miaoqiu had a smile on her face, but she still put on a serious face and pretended that she didn't know anything. Jingyu looked at Lu Miaoqiu and didn't panic. You, don't put on airs in front of me. Jingyu glared at Lu Miaoqiu and said, This trick of yours might work on Ling Lan, but it doesn't work on me. If you weren't behind this, I really don't believe that someone could do such a big thing under your nose. Jingyu looked at Lu Miaoqiu and said with a smile. Sigh. Lu Miaoqiu sighed deeply after hearing Jingyu's words and said bitterly, Has this consort become like this in your heart? This consort is really sad. Lu Miaoqiu laughed as she said this. Okay, let's get down to business. Lu Miaoqiu restrained her smile and said, You came back a little late. If you came back earlier, I wouldn't have to be trapped here. If you weren't here, I really wouldn't be able to continue acting. Lu Miaoqiu glared at Jingyu bitterly as she said this. It was as if she was saying that it was all Jingyu's fault that she couldn't go out to play. That's not right. Jingyu coughed silently and said seriously, If I came back earlier, how could there be such an effect? Look at the outside world now. You're being cursed by countless scholars. They're saying that you're a femme fatale and that you shouldn't be the empress. Jingyu said seriously, Isn't the effect better? Not bad indeed. Lu Miaoqiu smiled, then turned to look at Jingyu and asked, But how did you know that I was the one behind all this? I didn't leak any information at all. The 9 emperors can also predict the future, right? Ha ha ha. Jingyu laughed when she heard that. She said happily, Xiaochen only guessed that someone in the harem set a trap for you. He didn't think that all of this could be a trick that you designed yourself. As for me, Jingyu paused for a moment before continuing with a smile. At first, my thoughts were the same as Xiao Chen's. However, on the way to the palace, I thought about it carefully. The more I thought about it, the more I felt that something was amiss. When I saw you scolding the palace maids, I understood. From our conversation just now, I was sure that it was indeed you who did this. Jingyu looked at Lu Miaoqiu with a smile. Sigh. Lu Miaoqiu sighed deeply when she heard Jingyu's words. She said, "If Linglan had half your brain, why would I wait for you to come back?" Ha ha! If Linglan heard what you said, she would definitely jump up and down. Jingyu covered her mouth and laughed. Her eyes were full of smiles. She then turned to look at Lu Miaoqiu and said, "Tell me, what do you want to do? What else can I do?" "Of course, I want to monopolize the harem." Lu Miaoqiu smiled calmly and said, "Originally, I wanted to wait until the child was born before I made my move. However, recently, those palace concubines have been too rampant. Since they use tricks to make Xiao Yuling spend the night in the palace, if my men hadn't arrived in time, this Wang beauty might have become Wang Gue Fei," Lu Miaoqiu said with a frown. Chapter 1902. "So what are you doing?" Jingyu raised her eyebrows slightly and looked at Lu Miaoqiu. "Beating them at their own game? Or killing the chicken to warn the monkey?" "Of course it's both." Lu Miaoqiu touched her stomach and said, "But you only guessed half of it right. There's still half that you didn't guess." Lu Miaoqiu turned her head and smiled at Jingyu. "In? Which part?" Jingyu raised her eyebrows curiously and asked. "This time, I really didn't plan it." Lu Miaoqiu said seriously. "The Ninth Emperor's guessed correctly. Someone was targeting me. Unfortunately, I found out about it, so I took action. Since someone wants to make things difficult for me, I naturally can't be soft-hearted. So, I took advantage of the situation." Lu Miaoqiu said with a smile, "Since someone helped me plan this, I naturally have to perform well. Otherwise, wouldn't I be letting down the person who set up this stage? You're saying that this was planned by someone else?" Jingyu trembled when she heard this. She turned to look at Lu Miaoqiu and asked, "Then, do you know who this person is?" "I don't know yet." Lu Miaoqiu lowered her head and said, "This person will expose himself sooner or later. I'm just waiting here now. The person who dares to do such a thing under your nose is really daring," Jingyu said with admiration. "But now that you've gotten yourself into such a sorry state and made a mess inside and outside the palace, how do you plan to clean up this mess? Aren't I waiting for you to clean up this mess?" Lu Miaoqiu looked at Jingyu firmly and said, "Didn't you come into the palace to clean up this mess for me?" When Jingyu heard Lu Miaoqiu's words, her face instantly darkened. She furrowed her brows and finally sighed deeply. She lifted her hand to her forehead and said, "You're really a scary woman. Just a moment of carelessness, and even I was caught in the trap. Good yeah. I know you won't leave me in the lurch, not to mention..." Lu Miaoqiu looked at her stomach and said, "I can't move now. There are some things that I need your help to do." Jingyu was silent for a moment. Then, she turned her head and looked deeply at Lu Miaoqiu and said, "You pushed yourself into the teeth of the storm. What do you want to do?" "Jingyu, you know what I want to do." Lu Miaoqiu heard Jingyu's question and was stunned for a moment. Then, she slowly softened her body. The atmosphere in the room instantly became very strange. Jingyu looked at Lu Miaoqiu, looked at Lu Miaoqiu's slightly lowered head, looked at Lu Miaoqiu's silent appearance, and finally sighed deeply. "You're forcing Xiao Yuling to make a choice. Aren't you afraid of angering him?" Jingyu understood Lu Miaoqiu's meaning very well. Lu Miaoqiu put in so much effort to make this situation like this. There was only one purpose, and that was for Xiao Yuling. Yeah. Lu Miaoqiu smiled faintly at Jingyu and said calmly, "My purpose is very simple. At first, I thought I could just sit back and do nothing. However, when things really got to this point, I realized that I couldn't do it. No one can touch what's mine." When Lu Miaoqiu said this, the light in her eyes was so bright that it was scorching. Chapter 1903. Jingyu sat beside Lu Miaoqiu and saw the look in Lu Miaoqiu's eyes very clearly. Even if he is the emperor, why can't he set a precedent? Lu Miaoqiu turned to look at Jingyu and said, I want to force him to abolish the imperial harem and leave me as the empress. Jingyu was deeply shocked at this moment. She blinked and looked at Lu Miaoqiu for a while, then suddenly laughed out loud. Ha ha! Jingyu laughed out loud in front of Lu Miaoqiu. Lu Miaoqiu was confused by this laugh. Then she glared at Jingyu and asked angrily, What are you laughing at? Are you laughing at what I said? Of course not. Jingyu shook her head and said seriously. She put her hand on Lu Miaoqiu's shoulder and said, I didn't misjudge you. You are ambitious. Good. She was really like us modern people. Jingyu obviously didn't say this sentence. If it wasn't for the fact that Jingyu was so familiar with Lu Miaoqiu, she would have thought that Lu Miaoqiu was also a transmigrator. Huh. Lu Miaoqiu heard Jingyu's words and suddenly laughed. She said calmly, No woman is willing to share her husband with others. It's fine if I don't love this man. But now, I'm pregnant. Thinking about how there will be more children in the future who are not even my own and want to call me mother, I want to kill them. Lu Miaoqiu clenched her hands and said, A woman's jealousy is very scary. Jingyu stared at Lu Miaoqiu and said seriously, I didn't have such deep feelings in the past, but after seeing you today, I suddenly understand. It's really scary. If it were you, would you be able to tolerate it? Lu Miaoqiu turned to look at Jingyu and asked with a smile, If it were me? Jingyu immediately supported her head and said calmly, Those women definitely wouldn't even be able to take a step into the palace. If Xiao Chan dares to roll around with other women, I will castrate him. Lu Miaoqiu heard Jingyu's words and suddenly felt satisfied. Compared to you, I am much gentler. Lu Miaoqiu said calmly. Really? Jingyu glanced at Lu Miaoqiu and said, Don't think that I don't know how Beauty Wong died. TSK, TSK, TSK. Today, I have to treat you differently. Jingyu said with a happy smile. Jingyu asked someone to inquire about Beauty Wong's death. Only then did she know how humiliating Beauty Wong's death was. It was no wonder that Beauty Wong's father went crazy when he found out. That kind of punishment was really, I just let her get what she wanted. Lu Miaoqiu faintly curved her eyebrows. To the outside world, it was said that Beauty Wong hanged herself. However, Lu Miaoqiu was not a kind person. Beauty Wong was locked in a secret prison and tortured to death. When she died, there was not a single piece of skin on her body that was intact. Lu Miaoqiu fabricated the illusion that she hanged herself and then arrogantly sent the corpse to the Wong family. It caused a huge uproar in the Wong family. It was earth-shattering. However, the people of the Wong family could not spread this news. If this was spread, it would be a slap to their face, and Xiao Yuling would lose face. Chapter 1904. Therefore, the only thing the Wong family could do was to use all their strength to complain and berate Lu Miaoqiu. This was exactly what Lu Miaoqiu wanted to see. As the saying goes, a woman's heart is the most poisonous. Jingyu didn't seem to be affected. She calmly looked at Lu Miaoqiu and said, Tell me, what do you need me to do now? Jingyu smiled and asked calmly. And Lu Miaoqiu sat up slightly and said, I want you to stay in the palace with me. And why? Jingyu was slightly stunned when she heard Lu Miaoqiu's words. She asked in confusion, I suspect that person's next step is to make a move on my child. Lu Miaoqiu's eyes were full of seriousness as she said, Think about it. I have no place in the palace right now. Everyone's words are against me. The most useful thing to me now is the child in my stomach. Lu Miaoqiu slowly looked down at her stomach and said, If this child is gone, I will lose everything I rely on. It will be easy to abolish the empress. If the child is gone, not only will it be a blow to me, it will also be a chance for the emperor to make me fall out of favor. If it were me, I wouldn't be lenient, let alone that person. Lu Miaoqiu looked at Jingyu with a smile. So what do you mean? Jingyu frowned deeply. She looked at Lu Miaoqiu with a serious expression and said, You want to use your child as a bargaining chip? Miaoqiu, don't tell me you want to joke around with your child's life. I'm not joking. Lu Miaoqiu looked down at her stomach and said gently, Since this matter has come to this point, I won't allow myself to retreat. I don't dare to be so bold in the palace alone. But now you're back. Lu Miaoqiu turned to look at Jingyu seriously and said, "This is why I waited for you to come back. I need you to stay in the palace to help me." "No." Jingyu rejected her without hesitation. Her eyes were filled with seriousness as she stared at Lu Miaoqiu and said, I definitely can't let you risk your child. Moreover, you're about to give birth. If anything goes wrong, how do you want me to explain this?" Jingyu stared at Lu Miaoqiu with a determined expression. "Don't worry, I'm just throwing out a bait. I won't hurt the child." Lu Miaoqiu grabbed Jingyu's hand and said, You don't have a choice. You have to help me. Even if I don't take the initiative, the person in the dark will definitely find a way to make a move on my child. Since it's like this, why should I be passive?" Lu Miaoqiu looked at Jingyu with pleading eyes and said, "This is something I have to do. I don't want to be passive. Taking the initiative is the best choice. I want you to protect my child." Jingyu listened to Lu Miaoqiu's words and looked at Lu Miaoqiu's expression. She suddenly frowned, and her eyes were filled with anger. It was obvious that Lu Miaoqiu had this plan from the beginning. Now that she had taken this step, and Jingyu was powerless to stop her, she became even angrier. She stared at Lu Miaoqiu for a long time without saying a word. Chapter 1905. At this point, Jingyu couldn't refuse. No matter what, she had to protect Lu Miaoqiu and her son. "I'm really scared of you." Jingyu glared at Lu Miaoqiu and said, "How dare you scheme against me? After this is over, you'll see how I'll punish you. After this is over, you can punish me however you want." Lu Miaoqiu immediately sat up straight and said to Jingyu seriously. Then she laughed. Jingyu didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The door of the room was tightly shut. From time to time, laughter could be heard. The two of them seemed to be talking about something interesting. They talked until the sky turned dark. Jingyu and Lu Miaoqiu still didn't have enough fun. "Go tell the ninth empress that I won't be going back today. The empress hasn't been in a good mood these days. I'll stay in the palace to accompany the empress." Jingyu's words were sent back to the Wang mansion. Xiao Chun, who was waiting for Jingyu to come back, immediately had a dark expression. He looked unhappy. When everyone in the Wang mansion saw Xiao Chen's expression, they all lowered their heads silently. They didn't dare to say a word. When the madam wasn't in the Wang mansion, they suddenly felt that the atmosphere in the Wang mansion had dropped to a frightening level. "Madam, is it really okay if we don't go back?" Jingyu was arranged to stay in the side chamber of the empress's palace. Yin Xiao was Jingyu's personal maidservant. Naturally, she would accompany her. At this moment, she was helping Jingyu get dressed. She immediately asked nervously, "What are you afraid of?" Jingyu squinted her eyes and said calmly, "I'm doing something big. Our ninth emperors will understand." Jingyu said as she nodded her head firmly. Yin Xiao, who was at the side, finally let out a sigh of relief. Although she didn't know what Jingyu was talking about, there must be a reason behind it. With that thought in mind, Yin Xiao helped Jingyu massage her feet with a clear conscience. At this moment, the scene in the prince's mansion was completely different. Xiao Chan was lying on the bed with a book in his hand. However, he was unable to read the book. He tossed and turned, but was unable to fall asleep. In the end, he sat up with a cold face. This damned woman actually left him alone in the boudoir. Third Xing appeared in front of Xiao Chun. He lowered his head slightly and looked at Xiao Chun strangely as he asked, "Master, do you have any orders? Is there any news from 14th? Xiao Chun took a sip of the tea on the table and asked, "No." Third Xing looked at his master suspiciously. 14th had just entered the palace today. What news could he have sent back? Xiao Chun's frown deepened when he heard this. He pursed his lips tightly and said, "Do you know why Madam is staying in the palace?" When Xiao Chun asked this question again, Third Xing felt even more conflicted. Didn't Madam send back news? Third Xing was silent for a moment. He really didn't know how to answer. Could it be that Madam didn't stay in the palace because she wanted to accompany the Empress? Third Xing clearly knew that if he said that, he would definitely be strangled to death by his master. "Forget it, you can leave." Just when Third Xing was conflicted about how to answer, Xiao Chan suddenly waved his hand and said, Third Xing swallowed his saliva silently, nodded his head, and disappeared. Xiao Chun sat in his original position. His face was completely ashen. His brows were tightly knitted together as he played with the teacup in his hand. No one knew what he was thinking. Chapter 1906. Xiao Chun had a sleepless night, and Jingyu, who was in the palace, also had a restless sleep. Perhaps it was because of the sudden change of location, or because she was not used to not hearing Xiao Chen's voice before going to bed. Jingyu was half asleep and half awake the entire night. She got up when the sun rose. Did Madam not sleep well? Yin Xiao looked at the tiredness in Jingyu's eyes and asked worriedly, "I'm fine." Jingyu shook her head slightly and sat down slowly. She then asked, "Is Shirsi back?" "He's back. I'll call him over now." Yin Xiao nodded slowly and turned to call Shirsi over. Shirsi knelt down in front of Jingyu and said, "Greetings, madam. No need for formalities." Jingyu sat up slightly and said, "You don't have to kneel to me in the future. Get up. I asked you to scout out the palace last night. How did it go?" "I'm familiar with the routes in the palace." Shirsi nodded firmly and said, "Before entering the palace, third brother Xing gave me a map of the palace and asked me to memorize it. I familiarized myself with it last night." "Very good." Jingyu nodded slowly. The guards that Xiao Chun gave her were very reliable. "Clean up. After breakfast, we'll go to the Emperor's palace." Jingyu raised her hand slightly and pulled up her sleeves. She turned to look at Yin Xiao. "Yes." Yin Xiao and Shirsi nodded in response. "Oh, right." Jingyu suddenly thought of something. She turned to look at Shirsi and said, "What we're going to do now is very confidential. Don't tell Xiao Chen the details for now. Wait until I say it's okay to tell him. Then tell him the news. Do you understand?" "Yes." Shirsi paused slightly and nodded in response. "This is a very important matter. I know you're loyal to Xiao Chun, but if this message is leaked and the Empress or the prince in her belly is hurt in the slightest, I won't let you off easily. Do you understand?" Jingyu said as she looked at Shirsi with a warning gaze. "I don't dare. I'll follow Madam's orders." Shirsi quickly knelt down, and all the thoughts in his mind disappeared. He lowered his head tightly, and his eyes were filled with fear. Jingyu then nodded in satisfaction. "All right." Jingyu walked to the side of the table and sat down. She looked at the table full of dishes and said calmly, "Now, I want you to watch the Empress's meals and any clothes or accessories sent to the Emperor's palace. Nothing must go wrong." "Yes." Shirsi replied solemnly. Jingyu nodded in satisfaction. After Shirsi left, she then slowly ate her breakfast. When she saw Yin Xiao at the side, she frowned slightly. "Yin Xiao, there's an important task for you to do now." Jingyu looked at Yin Xiao calmly and said, "Madam, please instruct me." Yin Xiao bowed and replied, "In this harem, from the Empress and concubines to the palace maids and nannies, I need everyone's name list and background. You can't do it alone. I'll ask the Empress for it. I want you to help me analyze it. I remember that you were bought from the human traffickers by Xiao Chun, right? After traveling extensively for so many years, your knowledge might be more accurate than mine. I need your help." Jingyu looked at Yin Xiao seriously and said. Chapter 1907. "Yes." Yin Xiao bowed in response. Her heart was filled with excitement. Jingyu nodded her head in satisfaction. When Jingyu finished her breakfast and went to the Emperor's bedroom, Lu Miaoqiu had just woken up. Jingyu did not avoid the topic. She sat in the room and drank warm water. "The food in your palace is too salty," Jingyu complained unhappily. "I drank a lot of water this morning. Is it because you ate too bland in the prince's residence?" Lu Miaoqiu looked at Jingyu from the corner of her eyes. She put on a robe and walked in front of Jingyu. When she saw Jingyu's expression, she smiled faintly and said, "Look at how tired you are. Is it because you can't sleep well without the 9 emperors by your side?" Lu Miaoqiu looked at Jingyu teasingly. "Look at how happy you are. Last night, His Majesty came to stay the night again, right?" When Jingyu heard Lu Miaoqiu's words, she put on a fake smile. Lu Miaoqiu's expression became very interesting. You really don't want to suffer any losses." Lu Miaoqiu blushed slightly. "Last night, Xiao Yuling did come. Now that she was standing on the cusp of the storm, Xiao Yuling's attitude towards Lu Miaoqiu was still so good. This made Lu Miaoqiu feel very gratified. Jingyu obviously knew this as well. She just smiled faintly and did not say anything. Tell me, why did you come to find me so early in the morning? Lu Miaoqiu restrained her expression and looked at Jingyu calmly. Since I promised to protect you, I naturally can't go back on my word. Jingyu also sat up straight. She pursed her lips and looked at Lu Miaoqiu, saying, as the saying goes, know yourself and know your enemy, and you will never be defeated. I need the name list and background information of everyone in the palace. From you, the emperor, to all the palace maids and eunuchs. Jingyu calmly looked at Lu Miaoqiu and said, I knew you were here for this. Lu Miaoqiu winked at Jingyu and said calmly, as the empress, I don't have the ability to give you so many people's backgrounds. But last night, I whispered in the emperor's ear and obtained this token. Lu Miaoqiu took out a golden token from her sleeve and said, this is the emperor's exclusive token. With this, you can go to the Bureau of Personnel and see everyone in the palace. Is this enough? Lu Miaoqiu winked at Jingyu and said happily, this is really great. Jingyu's eyes suddenly lit up. Don't underestimate this Bureau of Officials. The background of the people recorded in this Bureau of Officials, from a little maid who just entered the palace to the ancestors of the previous emperor. The honor and disgrace of this generation are all recorded in it. If you don't have the emperor's personal order, you won't be able to enter. Lu Miaoqiu said seriously, you only have 1 day. You have to get this token back at night. When Jingyu heard this sentence, her body suddenly froze. She looked at Lu Miaoqiu with a strange expression and said, did you steal this token? Of course not. Lu Miaoqiu said in a serious tone, I just made a deal with the emperor to let him pretend to be deaf and mute for a day. Chapter 1908. Jingyu laughed when she heard that. She took the token from Lu Miaoqiu's hand and looked at it. Then she said seriously, I don't know much about the 9th emperors. I hope that the empress will allow me to enter the Bureau of Personnel to take a look. Granted. Lu Miaoqiu faintly curved her eyebrows. She couldn't be bothered with Jingyu's rubbish excuse and replied calmly. After Jingyu got the token, she turned around and headed outside. Yin Xiao followed Jingyu and headed towards the Bureau of Personnel in the palace. She did not try to hide anything and was extremely bold. She didn't seem to want to hide anything. When she arrived at the Bureau of Personnel, she showed the token and was immediately allowed to enter. Jingyu looked at the palace that looked like a library and blinked her eyes curiously. She looked around and followed the person in front of her. What are these? Jingyu looked at the books and asked curiously. These are all records of the big and small things that have happened since the founding of the Tokyo. There are also some records of the officials. The eunuch leading the way replied respectfully. He walked to a row of bookshelves and said respectfully, these are the records of the current imperial harem members. The 9th imperial concubine can look through them at will. Thank you. Jingyu nodded slowly to the eunuch. This is what this servant should do. If you need anything, just call this servant. The eunuch left after speaking. Jingyu raised her eyebrows slightly. When she reached out to look through the bookshelves, she also turned her head and asked Yin Xiao to do the same. When Jingyu was looking through the books, the 2 eunuchs outside the Bureau of Personnel gathered together. They looked into the pavilion and frowned. Why is the 9th imperial concubine here to look through the records of the imperial harem concubines? Who knows? The other eunuch said. When the 9th imperial concubine came in, she said that she was looking for the 9th emperors. However, since she has the emperor's token and entered the Bureau of Personnel, we can't control what she looks through. Yes. The eunuch nodded calmly. Then, he seemed to have thought of something and asked curiously, has the person who went to ask the emperor returned? We're back. His Majesty didn't say anything. From what I see, His Majesty is pretending that he didn't see anything. Let's not talk about it. Let's not talk about what we saw today. At such a time, it's best not to get into trouble. That's right. The 2 eunuchs nodded. As they spoke, they retreated to the side and waited quietly. Jingyu and Yin Xiao sat at the side of a table and browsed through the background. As they browsed through the background, they saw many interesting things. They also saw the dirty things that couldn't be exposed in the imperial harem of the previous dynasty. Jingyu's heart was filled with emotions. This was the imperial harem. This was human nature. Sisters turned against each other and became enemies. Corruption, adultery, framing, incest. These messy things were as numerous as the hairs on a cow. In such a huge imperial harem, there were actually so many things. It really shocked Jingyu. These people's backgrounds are very normal. There are no problems. Jingyu raised her hand and rubbed her sore eyes. After an entire morning, she had only looked through 1/3 of the records. If she continued like this, she couldn't continue. Chapter 1909. This servant didn't find anything strange. In Xiao reached out to massage Jingyu's shoulders. It looks like going first isn't a solution. Jingyu frowned deeply and said, "How about this? You quickly look through it and pick out the most suspicious person. Then we will analyze it again. This should be much faster." Yes. In Xiao nodded in agreement. After the master and servant casually finished their lunch, they opened the door and started searching again. Time passed by slowly. The originally neat bookshelf was now scattered with books all over the floor. Jingyu was already very tired. She stretched out her hand and rubbed her forehead. She casually flipped open the book that In Xiao passed to her. She was instantly stunned. Then she looked at In Xiao and said, "In Xiao, did you put in the wrong place?" Concubine Ruan, 24 years old. Her father is the governor of Yuanzhou. No matter if it is from the introduction of her parents or her background, she is so clean. Furthermore, her parents are famous for being upright officials and good people. Jingyu raised her eyebrows and said, after concubine Ruan entered the palace, no matter if it was the palace maids or eunuchs, she was even more kind. She had no interest in fighting for favor. Jingyu smiled helplessly and looked at In Xiao. "Why did you bring such an imperial concubine to me?" When In Xiao heard Jingyu's words, she was momentarily stunned. Then she walked over and knelt in front of Jingyu. She said very seriously, "This servant also thought for a while before bringing concubine Ruan to madam." "Oh." Jingyu instantly raised her eyebrows and looked at In Xiao curiously, asking, "Tell me your reason. Does madam not feel that concubine Ruan is really too perfect?" In Xiao frowned in confusion. She lowered her eyes and said, "From birth to entering the palace as an imperial concubine, she has been so perfect all the way. She's doing well and hasn't been discredited at all. Everyone's evaluation of her is mediocre. No one has said anything good about her, and no one has said anything bad about her. This servant feels that this is really too abnormal. Don't you think so, madam?" In Xiao's words seemed to ring an alarm bell in Jingyu's mind. The expression on her face slowly turned serious. She reached out and flipped through concubine Ruan's background. As she analyzed it bit by bit, the expression on her face instantly changed. "Continue," Jingyu said as she raised her hand slightly. "This servant has also expressed her own opinion." In Xiao pursed her lips slightly and said, "This servant feels that no matter how good an official's reputation is, there will always be some stains. There might not be any major crimes, but it is impossible for there to not be any small profits. If someone who just became an official had such intentions, it would be understandable. However, the governor of Yuanzhou has been an official for dozens of years and is clean. Don't you find it suspicious?" If this servant heard this servant would definitely not believe it, In Xiao said seriously. Said In Xiao in a very serious tone. Jingyu's eyes lit up bit by bit. There was an indifferent expression in her eyes. Immediately after, she seemed to have thought of something. She stretched out her hand and swept everything aside. She stretched out her hand and rummaged through everything. "What else do you want to say?" "Say it all at once," Jingyu said calmly. "Yes." In Xiao was slightly stunned when she saw Jingyu's actions. Chapter 1910. Then she opened her mouth again and said, "What makes this servant even more curious is that concubine Ruan entered the palace on her own accord. It says that concubine Ruan is a filial daughter. Knowing that her name was on the list of concubines, she entered the palace on her own accord. But according to what this servant knows, the current emperor did not give the order to kill her. In other words, concubine Ruan did not have to enter the palace, but she did. This is one of the suspicious points. If she entered the palace for father's career, then it is impossible for her not to fight for favor. Yin Xiao furrowed her brows and said, "But concubine Ruan seems to be an outsider. She does not have this intention at all. Just this alone is enough to make this servant unable to understand." "You are right." Jingyu's eyes lit up bit by bit. She quietly looked at the blueprints on the ground. That pair of golden-green eyes flashed with a strong light. This concubine Ruan, Jingyu looked at the blueprints on the ground and said, "is indeed an outsider." "What does Madam mean?" Yin Xiao looked at Jingyu's blueprints on the ground and asked in confusion. "Bringing you here today is indeed the most clear-cut." Jingyu happily curled the corners of her lips. Looking at the blueprints on the ground, she said, "Look carefully. From what you just said, I made a bold guess. If concubine Ruan is the person behind the scenes." Jingyu's slender finger slowly tapped on concubine Ruan's paper. She slowly slid her finger and said, "This is the palace maid that concubine Ruan gave the pastries to. This palace maid was transferred to Beauty Wang's palace and became Beauty Wang's personal palace maid. Noble Lady Ning and Beauty Wang had a conflict because of the pastries that the emperor gave." Jingyu slowly narrowed her eyes and said, "It was the same pastries, but concubine Ruan watched everything like an outsider. However, concubine Ruan's shadow was in all of these conflicts. Dong Chang's eye was seriously ill and was framed. Concubine Ruan came out to mediate. It's all because concubine Ruan came out to make peace. It's all because of this that it entered everyone's lives like air." Jingyu calmly narrowed her eyes and said, "Everyone turns a blind eye to this Ruan Pin, as if she is an existence that is dispensable. But in my eyes, it doesn't seem like that." Jingyu calmly curled the corners of her mouth. "Wonderful, truly wonderful." Jingyu carefully thought about these things, and a faint smile suddenly appeared in her eyes. She sighed and said, "Such meticulous planning, such exquisite calculations. No wonder Lu Miaoqiu fell for it." Jingyu looked at Ruan Pin with eyes full of admiration. This woman really made people gasp in admiration. For it means that the person behind this is concubine Ruan? Even though Yin Xiao was very suspicious of concubine Ruan, she couldn't see any evidence. It was all guesses. Now that she saw Jingyu's expression, she instantly asked curiously, "Most likely." Jingyu looked at all of this with satisfaction and curled the corners of her mouth. "Tidy up these things. We should go." Jingyu looked at the sky outside. This day had already passed. The candles in the room were all lit. The things that they wanted to see and find had already been found. Yes. Yin Xiao followed her instructions and tidied up these things. Then she helped Jingyu out the door. Chapter 1911. When they went out, Jingyu bowed her head slightly to the two eunuchs on guard and said, "Being pregnant makes me especially sleepy. I accidentally fell asleep while watching. I have troubled the two eunuchs to accompany me again. It is truly impolite. Ninth Imperial Concubine, you're too serious. This is what servants should do." When the two eunuchs heard Jingyu's words, they were momentarily stunned. After looking at each other, they calmly agreed. "Since that's the case, I won't disturb the two eunuchs." Jingyu gave Yin Xiao a look. Yin Xiao sensibly stepped forward and stuffed 2 banknotes into the hands of the two eunuchs. She smiled and said, "The two eunuchs have worked hard." Jingyu smiled faintly at the two eunuchs. It was a smile filled with all sorts of emotions. Then she turned around and walked out. The two eunuchs behind her looked at the banknotes in their hands and silently lowered their heads. Then they looked at each other and turned around to clean up the room before locking it up. Jingyu returned to Lu Miaoqiu's chambers with a tired body. She reached out and placed the token in front of Lu Miaoqiu. Then she picked up the water on the table and drank it. "I've finished using it. Here you go. How is it? Did you discover anything?" Lu Miaoqiu looked at Jingyu happily and asked, I can't tell you. Jingyu smiled faintly and said, since I'm going to perform, I naturally have to do my best. You just rest here. You. Lu Miaoqiu looked at Jingyu and was instantly unhappy. Miss, I haven't had a good rest today. I want to accompany you. Jingyu stood up and bowed slightly to Lu Miaoqiu. Then she went down. After taking a comfortable bath, she suddenly felt like she had been reborn. I'm so tired. Jingyu sat on the chair and closed her eyes slightly, allowing Yin Xiao to massage her shoulders. Madam, since we have discovered something, what should we do now? Yin Xiao pursed her lips and asked Jingyu. Now. Jingyu slowly opened her eyes and said, Now, let's see if our guess is true. If I'm not wrong, someone will go to the Bureau of Personnel tomorrow to ask. But I can be sure that the person who will go and ask is definitely not Concubine Ruan. Jingyu faintly raised her eyebrows and said, Then who could it be? Yin Xiao was instantly stunned as she asked doubtfully. Just wait and see. The show has only just begun. Jingyu was tired, probably because she tired during the day. Jingyu had her breakfast when she heard Yin Xiao hurriedly run in. Jing, early morning. And in the morning, after breakfast. Jingyu early in the morning had her breakfast. Jingyu early in the morning, she heard Jing. Madam, there's news. Yin Xiao happily ran in and said, Is there news from the Bureau of Personnel? Jingyu calmly looked at Yin Xiao and asked, Madam is really resourceful. 14th Prince just said that noble Lady Zhao in the east sent someone to ask the Bureau of Personnel. However, the people from the Bureau of Personnel didn't say anything. I heard that they even pushed away noble Lady Zhao's silver ingots. Yin Xiao happily said. Jingyu instantly covered her mouth and laughed. This imperial concubine gave out banknotes. Who would be interested in silver ingots? Madam is still the best. This servant's heart ached for those 2 banknotes for a long time. I didn't think that they would be so useful. Yin Xiao looked at Jingyu and said happily. Chapter 19:12. I never do business that loses money. Jingyu calmly curled the corners of her mouth slightly. She then turned her head to look at Yin Xiao and said, Let's follow noble Lady Zhao's investigation and see who ordered her to do this. Yes, I will do it now. Yin Xiao bowed. Jingyu calmly waved her hand. Hearing such good news early in the morning, Jingyu's eyebrows curled up in delight. She leaned on the soft couch to rest for a while before heading towards Lu Miaoqiu's palace after resting. Lu Miaoqiu was eating desserts. When she saw Jingyu, she waved her hand and dismissed everyone. Jingyu then sat opposite Lu Miaoqiu. How do you feel today? Jingyu asked Lu Miaoqiu calmly. How else can I feel? Lu Miaoqiu lowered her head and looked at her body. She then looked at Jingyu strangely and said, Did you find something? Let's wait and see. Jingyu happily curled her brows. Just as the 2 of them were talking, they saw Xing Shirsi return. He bowed and stood beside Jingyu. He carefully leaned forward and whispered into Jingyu's ear. What is the matter between you 2? Why are you guarding against me? Lu Miaoqiu looked at Jingyu and Xing Shirsi's behavior and frowned in dissatisfaction. Are you sure you didn't see wrongly? Jingyu frowned and turned to ask Xing Shirsi. I'm sure. Xing Shirsi nodded seriously. Could I have guessed wrongly? Jingyu frowned deeply. Her eyes were filled with doubt. She looked at Lu Miaoqiu and asked, What do you think of Concubine Ruan in your palace? Concubine Ruan? Lu Miaoqiu heard Jingyu's question and frowned slightly. She seemed to be thinking carefully about who this Concubine Ruan was. I have some impression of her. This Concubine Ruan is well-educated and not very obedient. Lu Miaoqiu nodded and said, Her etiquette is not bad at all. What I am most satisfied with is that she knows when to advance and when to retreat. Let's hear it. Jingyu heard Lu Miaoqiu and nodded calmly. Why are you so interested in Concubine Ruan? Could it be? Lu Miaoqiu looked at Jingyu curiously. I've said it before. Only by knowing yourself and your enemy can you win 100 battles. Right now, I just want to hear your opinion. Jingyu propped up her head and said calmly. Huh? Lu Miaoqiu heard Jingyu's words and laughed involuntarily. She faintly curved her brows and said, I don't have a deep relationship with this concubine Ruan. However, I am still surprised that she is suspected. When I first entered the palace, everyone wanted to gain the emperor's favor. Concubine Ruan was no exception. However, after I gave her a warning, Concubine Ruan understood and stopped participating. This made me pay attention to Concubine Ruan for a while. A person with such breadth of mind is either very scheming and ambitious, or she is afraid of the powerful and only wants to protect her life. Lu Miaoqiu faintly curved her brows and said, "But it is clear that Concubine Ruan is neither. I only found out after a few investigations." "So Concubine Ruan has a sweetheart." Lu Miaoqiu faintly pursed her lips and said, "This is a big taboo in the palace. Naturally, they don't dare to spread it. I also spent a lot of effort to find out." Chapter 19:13. Concubine Ruan entered the palace because her father used her sweetheart's future as a threat. Thus, Concubine Ruan entered the palace on her own accord. The twists and turns in this matter cannot be written down on a piece of paper. You can see the surface in the Bureau of Officials, but there are actually many hidden paths. Lu Miaoqiu faintly arched her brows and said, "It is precisely because of this that I did not pay much attention to Concubine Ruan after that." After Jing Yu finished listening to Lu Miaoqiu's words, a serious expression slowly appeared on her face. Her brows furrowed deeply. It looked like this matter was much more complicated than she had thought. Why was this so? There must be some connection between this matter, but it also seemed like there was no connection. Jing Yu had a very deep intuition that there must be something wrong with this Concubine Ruan. But for some reason, Jing Yu felt that this Concubine Ruan was not the biggest problem. After listening to Lu Miaoqiu's words, why did Jing Yu feel that this Concubine Ruan was very likely to be a chess piece? That shouldn't be the case. Jing Yu returned to her own palace with a heart full of doubts. She sat on the soft couch and thought bitterly, but did not come to any conclusion. She sighed deeply and finally stood up. She called out to Xing Shirsi and said that she wanted to go out for a walk. Xing Shirsi acknowledged and carefully supported Jing Yu as they walked around the palace. Why were there always so many women who wanted to enter the palace with their heads broken? This time, if Lu Miaoqiu really won and forced Xiao Yuling to issue an edict to abolish the imperial harem, this harem would probably also be peaceful. As Jing Yu walked, from time to time, palace maids and eunuchs would pass by. They would all respectfully bow and greet her. At the beginning, Jing Yu could still speak. Later on, she just nodded slightly. She did not know which courtier they passed by. Suddenly, she saw a young man sitting in a pavilion not far away and playing chess with someone. "Who is that?" Jing Yu raised her eyebrows curiously and asked the palace maid beside her. This palace maid was given to Jing Yu by Lu Miaoqiu. She was afraid that Jing Yu would get lost in the palace, so she sent a palace maid to follow her. "Yes, Your Highness," the palace maid replied respectfully. "Your Highness, Ninth Prince?" Jing Yu frowned even more doubtfully. "Madam, His Highness the Ninth Prince is the Emperor's younger brother. He is still young and has yet to be bestowed with a title. He can only leave the palace at the age of 15 to build a residence and stay in the imperial city or be assigned a fief," Xing Shirsi said slowly. "He can only be crowned king at the age of 15. Jing Yu frowned as she stared at the smiling child. His Highness the Ninth Prince's birth mother died early. In the Tokyo Palace, if a prince's birth mother has more than 4 concubines, if he has some merit or is favored by the emperor, it is not impossible for him to be crowned king early, Xing Shirsi said again. At this point, if Jing Yu still didn't understand, then she would really be a fool. To put it bluntly, His Highness the Ninth Prince had no background, no status, and no one doted on him. Now that the late emperor had passed away, it was already good that Xiao Yuling did not kill him. She still wanted to make him a king early. What was the point of making him a king? To let him fight for the throne with her? Jing Yu understood Xiao Yuling very well. His Highness the Ninth Prince was probably going to be spoiled in the harem. In the future, she would just find a remote and desolate place and let His Highness the Ninth Prince fend for himself. Back then, The battle for the throne was so intense, but His Highness the Ninth Prince was still a child. Chapter 1914. Jingyu had no impression of this ninth prince at all. She recalled that Shangwan Linglan had mentioned him once. Those princes were all dead, but this ninth prince was still alive and well. How interesting. Jingyu stood in place and silently looked at him, then turned around and walked away. In the pavilion, a small youth was holding a chess piece in his hand. His eyes were looking in the direction where Jingyu had just stood. His eyes were shining with an intense light, and his dark eyes were flickering with uncertainty. Ninth Prince? It's your turn. The person sitting opposite the ninth prince had a familiar face. Who else could it be but Xiao Yijuan? Teacher's chess skills are so exquisite. This student really can't win. The ninth prince was Xiao Ye's ninth and youngest son. His name was Xiao Chunglin. Ninth prince overpraises me. Xiao Yijuan calmly lowered his head and said, Ninth prince didn't call this official here just to ask for advice on chess, right? Huh? Xiao Chunglin laughed casually and said, The emperor often says that teacher's knowledge is unparalleled. This prince wants teacher to teach this prince. I wonder if teacher is willing? Ninth prince is too serious. Xiao Yijuan lowered his head and said, This official's skills are not good enough. I'm afraid that I will disappoint ninth prince. I dare not presume to accept the responsibility of teaching. Please forgive me, ninth prince. Xiao Yijuan stood up and knelt down. When Xiao Chunglin saw Xiao Yijuan's expression, his expression changed for a moment. Then, his expression quickly changed as he stared deeply at Xiao Yijuan. Suddenly, he laughed out loud. Ha ha! Xiao Chunglin happily said, This prince naturally won't force you. I called teacher here today because I heard that during the Tokyo festival, teacher was taught by the 9 emperors and solved the 9 palace maze. Is that true? It was just a moment of good luck. It's not worth mentioning. Xiao Yijuan's eyes revealed confusion. He didn't know why Xiao Chunglin was asking this. This prince heard that the 9 palace maze is very extraordinary. I wonder if teacher can demonstrate it again for this prince to make up for the regret of not being able to see it when I was young? Xiao Chunglin asked with a faint smile. It happened too long ago. This official already doesn't remember the 9 palace maze. Please forgive me, ninth prince. Xiao Yijuan was silent for a moment and said. Xiao Chunglin's expression immediately changed when he heard this. Huh? Xiao Chunglin laughed and said, If that's the case, this prince won't force you. If teacher thinks of it in the future, come find this prince. Thank you for your understanding, Your Highness, Xiao Yijuan said slowly. After this conversation, Xiao Yijuan still could not guess why His Highness the Ninth Prince suddenly looked for him. Could it be that he really wanted to see the 9 palace puzzle? It didn't make sense. After Xiao Yijuan left the palace, he thought about it and decided to tell Xiao Chun about it. However, when he arrived at the prince's mansion, he was told that the 9 emperors wasn't in and had gone out to handle some matters. Xiao Yijuan had no choice but to leave for now and come back tomorrow. In the palace, Xiao Chunglin was still sitting in the pavilion and looking at the chessboard. The corners of his mouth curled up in disdain. He reached out to pick up a chess piece and slowly placed it down. The chessboard that was originally a dead end was actually revived. Chapter 1915. As expected, it is the 9th imperial concubine. Xiao Chunglin calmly curled his lips slightly. The palace maids and eunuchs standing outside the pavilion lowered their heads respectfully. Jingyu returned to her room after making a round. Yin Xiao also returned at this time. Jingyu sat on the soft couch and listened to Yin Xiao's report. Instantly, she furrowed her brows and her eyes were filled with confusion. You're saying that noble lady Zhao did not contact concubine Ruan? Jingyu looked at Yin Xiao and asked, Then why did noble lady Zhao go to the Bureau of Personnel to inquire about my whereabouts? This servant does not know either. Yin Xiao also furrowed her brows. This investigation was not as Jingyu guessed. Instantly, Jingyu furrowed her brows in confusion. Beside her, Xing Shirsi and Yin Xiao also had a helpless expression. Shirsi, I asked you to keep an eye on the Empress. Did you discover anyone with dirty hands? Jingyu turned to ask Xing Shirsi. This servant did not discover anything unusual. Xing Shirsi slowly shook his head and said, "This servant has checked the Empress' meals and clothes. This servant did not discover anything unusual." Jingyu nodded her head slowly. Everything seemed normal. However, for some reason, the more it was like this, the more uneasy Jingyu felt. She kept feeling that she had overlooked something important. Jingyu thought about it for a long time. In the end, she reached out her hand and pressed deeply between her brows. It was really heart-wrenching. "Shirsi, go and keep an eye on concubine 1. There must be something wrong with her." Jingyu turned to look at Xing Shirsi and said, "Yes." Xing Shirsi responded. Jingyu nodded her head in satisfaction. At the same time, she told Lu Miaoqiu to be careful. Looking at the situation outside, a storm was brewing. Everything seemed to be peaceful. On this day, Jingyu was reading in her room when she saw a palace maid walk in with a pot of flowers. This servant greets the 9th imperial concubine. The emperor bestowed a few pots of precious flowers. The empress asked this servant to send a pot to the 9th imperial concubine's bedroom. The palace maid knelt on the ground and said respectfully, "Thank the empress for me." Jingyu looked at the delicate flowers and nodded her head calmly. But she laughed in her heart. She was just staying here, but Lu Miaoqiu was so attentive. Jingyu didn't take this matter to heart. Looking at the flower pot placed here, it added to the scenery in the room. Jingyu nodded her head slightly and continued to read the book in her hand. In the afternoon, Jingyu went out for a walk as usual. When she passed by the garden, she saw many palace maids picking flower petals. Jingyu raised her eyebrows slightly. "In Xiao," said from the side, "These palace maids must be picking flower petals for their mistress to use for a flower petal bath. So these flower petals are all freshly picked." Jingyu raised her eyebrows slightly when she heard this. In Xiao nodded her head and replied, "Yes, the flower petal bath that Foreign used in the past was also freshly picked. But now that Foreign is pregnant, this servant thinks that it's better not to use it." Jingyu nodded her head slowly. She really didn't care about such things. When she turned her head back, she suddenly saw such a scene. The 2 palace maids who were talking by the side of the road were holding flower baskets in their hands. They seemed to be discussing something. Jingyu stopped in her tracks and waved her hand slightly at In Xiao, indicating for her not to make a sound. She frowned slightly and listened by the side. Chapter 1916. My flower petals are a bit fresher. Take them to Her Highness the Empress. That palace maid carefully held the flower petals in her hands and placed them in the other's basket. "Many thanks, big sister Xiaohe. Recently, Her Highness the Empress has been extremely fond of this flower petal bath. This servant has almost picked all the flowers in the imperial garden." That palace maid seemed to be very helpless as she spoke. Her slightly furrowed brows appeared to be very vexed. Her Highness the Empress is doted on by the Emperor. Isn't it easy for her to get this flower petal bath? On the other hand, our Her Highness, that palace maid seemed to want to say something, but when she reached this point, she paused and silently pursed her lips. "I still have matters to attend to in the palace, so I won't nag you anymore." That palace maid slightly lowered her head and casually said a few words before leaving. Jingyu looked at that palace maid's departing figure and slightly furrowed her brows. She said to In Xiao beside her, "Find someone and follow her to see which palace maid she is from." "Yes." In Xiao nodded in response and hurriedly ran outside. Jingyu silently turned her head to look at the flowers in the imperial garden from afar. She then turned her head to look at the departing palace maid of the Empress. She slightly waved her hand at the people beside her and had them stop that palace maid. "This servant greets the 9th imperial concubine." That palace maid probably didn't expect Jingyu to stop her and instantly knelt on the ground in a bit of a panic. "Stand up." Jingyu slightly raised her head and said, "The flower petals in your basket, are you going to give them to the Empress?" Replying to the 9th imperial concubine, "I'm going to give them to Her Highness the Empress." That palace maid bowed and replied while kneeling. Why did you exchange flower petals with a palace maid just now? Jingyu calmly raised her brows and asked. That palace maid was slightly taken aback and hurriedly said, This servant saw that the flower petals in Xiaohi's basket were very fresh, so I exchanged them. That's strange. Jingyu faintly arched her eyebrows and said, Both of you picked the petals from the same garden. Why is yours not as good as hers? Nubi doesn't know. The palace maid lowered her head in fear and said, The petals that Xiaohi plucked every time are especially tender and fresh. Nubi wants to give the Empress the best petals, so I exchanged with Xiaohi. Jingyu narrowed her eyes. She raised her hand calmly and said, Show me the flower petals in your basket. Yes. The palace maid presented the basket in her hands. Jingyu reached out and looked at it. It was indeed a petal that was incomparably tender and beautiful. There was not a single crease on it. Jingyu frowned slightly. She reached out and folded the petal, then put it back. The creases on the flower petals were still there, but the creases were still brand new. There were no signs of it turning yellow. Flower petals were always fresh. If they were left for too long, they would turn yellow. Moreover, the root of the flower would also turn yellow. However, the flower petals did not turn yellow. Guards! Jingyu's expression suddenly turned cold as she called out. Go to the Empress's chambers and invite all the imperial physicians here. Jingyu's golden-green eyes were filled with coldness. Yes. The palace maid looked at Jingyu's expression and her heart suddenly thumped. She did not even think and hurriedly agreed. Lu Miaoqiu had just finished eating her snacks when she saw Jingyu rushing into her room. There was a large group of imperial physicians behind her. Seeing this, Lu Miaoqiu was stunned. What happened? Chapter 1917. Go and take the Empress's pulse. Jingyu ordered the imperial physician with a cold expression. Lu Miaoqiu was confused by Jingyu's actions. Why was she taking the Empress's pulse? Did you find anything? Jingyu asked with a frown. The imperial physician retracted his hand and bowed respectfully in front of Jingyu. The Empress's fetus has been affected. Her pulse is unstable. I will prescribe some medicine for the Empress to prevent miscarriage. Did you find out what caused the Empress's fetus to be unstable? Jingyu's eyes were filled with seriousness. Lu Miaoqiu immediately understood what Jingyu meant when she heard Jingyu and the imperial physician's conversation. In my opinion, we should check the Empress's diet. We can't be sure of the specifics yet. The imperial physician said carefully. If there was any mistake in his words, he would be blamed for it. There's no need to check. Take a look at this. Jingyu said calmly. There were many fresh flower petals in the basket. Yes. The imperial physician went forward to check the basket with an uneasy heart. He first reached out to take a look. Then, he picked up the flower petals and rubbed them. His expression became very interesting, and he suddenly knelt down. Please forgive me, Your Highness. Please forgive me, Ninth Imperial Concubine. The imperial physician trembled as he knelt on the ground. What did you find? Speak. Jingyu's expression was cold. Lu Miaoqiu's expression also changed. These flower petals have been sprinkled with an addictive poison. When it comes into contact with water, it will spread through the skin. It will affect a pregnant woman's fetus. It is very likely to cause a miscarriage. The imperial physician's body was trembling uncontrollably. His words shocked everyone present, and they all knelt down. Poison. Jingyu looked at the flower petals indifferently. Then, she suddenly turned to look at the palace maid who plucked the flower and shouted, You should be punished. Please forgive me, Your Highness. I don't know anything. These flower petals were given to me by Xiaohe. When the imperial physician finished speaking, the palace maid was so frightened that her legs turned to jelly. She knelt on the ground, and her eyes were filled with shock. Who is Xiaohe? Bring her here. Lu Miaoqiu's hands and feet instantly turned cold. She looked at the flower basket and covered her stomach. Her eyes were filled with horror. Your Highness, Xiaohe and noble Zhao have been brought here. A voice sounded from outside. Jingyu and Lu Miaoqiu were both sitting on high seats. Because of this incident, the harem was in an uproar. Jingyu slowly lowered her eyes. The emperor had also come after hearing the news. What's going on? When Xiao Yuling heard that Lu Miaoqiu had been poisoned, she almost instantly rushed to Lu Miaoqiu's palace. When she saw that Lu Miaoqiu was safe and sound, she slowly let out a sigh of relief. "Noble Zhao, what do you have to say?" Noble Zhao, who was kneeling in the hall, was wearing a purple-red robe. At this moment, her delicate face was deathly pale. Beside her, the palace maid, Xia, was also kneeling on the ground with a face full of cold sweat. Your Highness, Qin Xia has been wronged." Noble Zhao looked at Xiao Yuling with teary eyes and said, "Qin Xia only knows that the medicine can guarantee the freshness of the fruits and vegetables. Qin Xia had someone bring it from the kitchen. I know that your Highness likes flower petal baths, so I had the palace maid use it on the flower petals." Chapter 1918. Is that so? Xiao Yuling slowly frowned. She looked at the palace maid beside noble Lady Zhao and asked, "You took it from the kitchen?" Replying to your Majesty, "This servant took it from the kitchen. This servant really didn't know that this medicine was poison." Xiaohi was on the verge of tears. Jingyu watched this scene quietly with her head propped up. She squinted her eyes calmly. In the blink of an eye, the person from the kitchen was also brought in for questioning. This proved that the medicine was indeed taken from the kitchen. How did this thing appear in the kitchen? Why didn't we know anything about this? Xiao Yuling had someone bring the powder over for the imperial physician to examine carefully to see if there was a problem with the medicine. However, when the imperial physician examined it, he was surprised. There was no trace of poison in the medicine. Noble Lady Zhao, this medicine was fine in the kitchen. Why did it become poison in your hands? Xiao Yuling looked at noble Lady Zhao with an ashen face and asked, Your Majesty, this concubine really doesn't know what's going on. Your Majesty, you must believe this concubine. Noble Lady Zhao's eyes were filled with panic. She looked like she had something to say. Xiao Yuling was in a fit of anger. Just as she was about to give the order, Jingyu suddenly said, Your Majesty, Ninth Imperial Concubine, is there anything else? Xiao Yuling frowned and looked at Jingyu as she asked, Your Majesty, since the problem isn't with the powder, why don't Your Majesty take a look at the flower basket? Jingyu's gaze landed on the flower basket. She narrowed her eyes and said to the Imperial Physician, Imperial Physician, please come forward and examine it. Yes. The Imperial Physician glanced at Xiao Yuling. After receiving Xiao Yuling's signal, he went forward and picked up the flower basket to examine it. He had someone bring over hot water and a blade. Then, in front of everyone, he gently scraped off a layer of wax from the basket. Behind this layer of wax was a black bamboo basket. Instantly, everyone's expression changed. Your Majesty, this is a deadly poison. Fortunately, it was wrapped in wax, and only a little smell was released. The flower petals were also contaminated with this smell. That's why the Empress was poisoned very slowly. Otherwise, the Imperial Physician didn't finish his sentence, but everyone present understood. Instantly, everyone's expression became incomparably unsightly. Where did this flower basket come from? Xiao Yuling looked at the people below her with an ashen face. It was sent by the people from the Bureau of the Imperial Concubine. Go and call the people from the Bureau of Imperial Affairs over. Xiao Yuling coldly shouted, The Imperial Concubine. Concubines is the concubine. Chapter 1919. Jingyu looked at concubine Ruan's appearance, and her heart suddenly jumped. She felt an uneasy feeling pass through her heart. Your Majesty, Qin Xie confesses. Concubine Ruan's confession was too sudden. The woman on the ground was so determined. She tightly pursed her lips and said, Qin Xie is jealous of the Empress. What right does she have to monopolize the harem and monopolize the Emperor? Beauty Wong was instructed by me to attack the Empress. Originally, I thought that Beauty Wong would be able to cause the Empress' stomach to explode. However, I didn't expect that the Empress had already planned this. Not only did she not succeed, she also lost her life. Everything that happened after that was all planned by me. Until today, this flower basket was also delivered by me after many twists and turns. Originally, I thought that noble Lady Zhao would take the blame. However, I didn't expect that the ninth imperial concubine would be so powerful. Ruan Yang is very impressed. Concubine Ruan said as she faintly turned to look at Jingyu. The strange expression in her eyes caused Jingyu's expression to change slightly. You have guts to poison the Empress. Xiao Yuling was so angry that her face turned ashen. Jingyu deeply frowned. The Empress monopolizes the harem. Us concubines can't even see the Emperor's face. Anyone who has the slightest thought will be heavily reprimanded by the Empress. Your Majesty, what is the point of keeping such a harem? I can't accept this. I can't accept to grow old alone in this harem. Your Majesty, since you don't love us, you don't want to favor us, why do you want us to enter the palace? You want us to wither in the depths of the palace at the age of flowers. We want to have the chance to love. We can't be together with the person we love. Your Majesty, all of this was planned by me. I can't accept this. Concubine Ruan's words instantly expressed everyone's thoughts. Noble Lady Zhao trembled as she knelt on the ground. At this moment, her face was filled with tears. Jingyu looked at Concubine Ruan kneeling on the ground, and her heart trembled. Someone come. Concubine Ruan framed the Empress. Remove her position as concubine and throw her into prison to await punishment. Xiao Yuling suddenly said after a short moment of silence. Her cold words carried a power that could not be refused. Ruan Pin was taken away, but the atmosphere in the room did not ease. All the puzzles had been solved. Because of Ruan Pin's words, Xiao Yuling had been forced to make a choice. This was what Lu Miaoqiu wanted to see. She had done it. Jingyu had already done everything she could. As for what Lu Miaoqiu and Xiao Yuling were going to do, it was not Jingyu's concern. Jingyu didn't know that the matter was settled, but she didn't feel relaxed at all. She went back to her room and waited quietly. She was ready to leave the palace tomorrow. Since the matter in the palace was settled, it was time for her to leave. The next day, Jingyu went out of the palace. She was still a little absent-minded when she left the palace. She frowned and wondered if she was worrying too much. Otherwise, why would she be so uneasy? Jingyu sighed deeply. After she left the palace, she got off the sedan chair and prepared to change to the carriage. Be careful. Don't damage the flowers. Jingyu was about to get into the carriage when she suddenly heard the voice of a palace maid. She immediately stopped and curiously turned her head to look. She saw the young eunuch carefully holding the flowers. This is... Jingyu frowned in confusion. Madam, this servant saw that the flowers were blooming so beautifully, so this servant brought them along. Yin Xiao saw Jingyu's gaze and immediately said. Chapter 1920. This flower is really interesting. It has bloomed for so long, and yet it hasn't withered at all. Yesterday, this servant forgot to water it, and it didn't wither at all. This servant thought that it was fresh and brought this flower along. Yin Xiao looked at Jingyu seriously. It won't wither? Jingyu was stunned when she heard Yin Xiao's words. The expression on her face changed rapidly. She frowned deeply and walked towards the flower pot. Yin Xiao looked at Jingyu's actions with a puzzled expression. Jingyu pursed her lips and stared at the flower pot for a long time. Then, as if she thought of something, she suddenly pushed the flower pot and smashed it on the ground. The moment the flower pot was smashed on the ground, a centipede emerged from the soil of the flower pot. This scene shocked Yin Xiao, Xing Shirsi, and the rest. Xing Shirsi took a big stride forward and chopped the centipede with his blade. Then, he protected Jingyu and retreated slightly. So, the problem lies with the flower pot. Jingyu frowned deeply and said deeply. Looking at the centipede that was killed by Xing Shirsi, Jingyu went silent for a moment. Then, as if she thought of something, the color on her face instantly faded. Madam, when Yin Xiao turned around and saw Jingyu's deathly pale face, she was immediately alarmed and hurriedly called out, Miaoqiu, Miaoqiu, hurry and go back. Jingyu called out in a panic. Lu Miaoqiu didn't know what happened in front of the palace gate. At this moment, after Lu Miaoqiu ate some snacks as usual, she was trimming the fresh flowers. She said with satisfaction, these pots are well taken care of. Your Highness, these pots of flowers were sent by His Majesty. No wonder your Highness took such good care of them. A palace maid by the side said happily with her brows slightly arched. It's just that it smells a little too good. As Lu Miaoqiu spoke, she bent down slightly and sniffed the flower. She thought to herself that this was really a rare flower. After so many days, it still smelled so good. Lu Miaoqiu slowly put down the scissors in her hand. Just as she was about to turn around and water the flower, she suddenly froze. The expression on Lu Miaoqiu's face faded little by little, and her face suddenly turned pale. Your Majesty, Nyang, what's wrong? Someone come. Someone come. From the Empress's palace, the earth-shattering shouts came out. The entire palace was in a mess. Everyone was rushing towards the palace. Your Majesty, I'm afraid the Empress is about to give birth. The female doctor and the midwife were brought to the palace as quickly as possible. Inside the room, Lu Miaoqiu's cries of pain could be heard. What? It's not even the due date, and she's about to give birth. Xiao Yuling was scared out of her wits. On the way back, Jingyu heard the news. Her hands couldn't help but tremble. She almost held her stomach as she ran into Lu Miaoqiu's palace. Jingyu looked at Xiao Yuling with trembling eyes and said, There's something wrong with those flowers. Hurry and take them away. Jingyu didn't even have the time to kneel as she spoke in a fluster. Xiao Yuling looked at Jingyu with shock in her eyes. When the imperial physician examined the flowers, her face turned pale with fright. In the soil of the flower pots, there were actually drugs that could cause a pregnant woman to miscarry. At this moment, the screams that came out from the room were so frightening. Chapter 1921. Your Majesty, the Empress is having a difficult labor. The child might not be born. The midwife knelt beside Xiao Yuling and said with a trembling body, What did you say? Say it again. The expression on Xiao Yuling's face suddenly disappeared. Jingyu, who was standing at the side, also suddenly widened her eyes. Then she felt the world spin and her mind go blank. Her body uncontrollably fell backwards. Madam, you, This incomparably panicked call was the last voice Jingyu heard. It was Xiao Chen's voice. Jingyu did not know what exactly happened while she was unconscious. Jingyu only knew that she had a very chaotic dream. In this dream, Jingyu seemed to have died and was floating in a pitch-black space. One moment, it was the scene of her death in the modern world. The next moment, it was everything after her rebirth. That kind of chaos was unclear, but there seemed to be some kind of mysterious connection between them. Finally, as if a very tiring journey had ended, Jingyu slowly opened her eyes and saw the familiar bed. Jingyu was slightly dazed. Just as she was about to move her hand, she realized that her hand was grabbed by someone. When Jingyu turned her head, she saw Xiao Chun sleeping by the side of the bed. Her heart trembled slightly. She did not speak or move. She just quietly looked at Xiao Chun. She looked at his handsome face. She looked at the face that was engraved in her heart. Just as Jingyu looked at Xiao Chun suddenly screamed and jumped up. Looking at his frightened face, it was as if he had dreamed of something very frightening. His eyes were filled with panic. Xiao Chun, what's wrong? Jingyu looked at Xiao Chun and frowned. She asked worriedly, You're awake. When Xiao Chun heard Jingyu's voice, joy immediately appeared in his eyes. He reached out and helped Jingyu up. Leaning against the bed, he asked worriedly, Do you feel uncomfortable anywhere? I'm fine. Jingyu slowly shook her head and asked, Where's Miaoqiu? The Empress is fine. When Xiao Chun saw that Jingyu was really fine, he said, Don't worry, the Empress gave birth to a little prince. Both mother and child are safe. Really? That's great. When Jingyu heard Xiao Chen's words, she slowly let out a sigh of relief. However, the Empress is still unconscious right now. Although her life is saved, her body, Xiao Chen's brows tightly knit. I've already sent Zhao's Miaoqiu. I've already sent a message. Use Miaoqiu. What about the child? When Jingyu heard this, her expression immediately changed. She reached out and grabbed Xiao Chun. Are those flowers poisonous? Is the child safe? Is he all right? He's fine. Xiao Chun reached out and touched Jing Yu's head. You really took too much of a risk. If I was a little slower and you made the slightest mistake, what would I do? When Xiao Chun spoke, his eyes were filled with seriousness. 14th Prince has already told me everything. Xiao Chun sat down beside Jing Yu's bed and said, those flowers were presented to the Emperor by the 9th Prince, Xiao Chunlin. With the Emperor's help, they were given to you and the Empress. Concubine Ruan is only a chess piece in the 9th Prince's hands. When Xiao Chun spoke, his eyes were filled with darkness. Chapter 1922. Your Highness. Jing Yu's eyes widened when she heard Xiao Chun's words. Her face was full of shock. Yes. Xiao Chun reached out and grabbed Jing Yu's hand. He said seriously, I have to thank Yijuan for this. If he hadn't told me about His Highness, I wouldn't have thought of him and wouldn't have followed this path to find him. So that's how it is. Jing Yu slowly nodded. After hearing Xiao Chun's words, she realized that Xiao Yijuan had told Xiao Chun about Xiao Chunlin looking for him. This was why Xiao Chun became suspicious. No wonder he came to the palace so quickly. What is Xiao Yuling's reaction now? Jing Yu asked again. Fortunately, the Empress and her son are safe. However, the Empress is still in a coma. This time, His Highness has completely angered the Emperor. However, during the investigation, it was discovered that the person who wanted to harm the Empress was His Highness's trusted aide. This person also said that His Highness didn't know anything about this. The Emperor is not a fool. Naturally, he wouldn't believe such words. However, there is no conclusive evidence to prove that His Highness was the one who did it. Thus, His Highness can be spared from death, but he can't escape punishment. Xiao Chun faintly narrowed his eyes. I think this is the best way. The Emperor will probably banish this person from the imperial city and exile him. Xiao Chun faintly lowered his eyes and said, I think so. Jing Yu was slightly stunned when she heard this. Then, she calmly nodded and said, after all, he is the Emperor's blood brother. It is impossible to kill him just like that. Exile should be the best result. Huh? Xiao Chun laughed and shook his head. You underestimate the Emperor too much. His Highness won't be able to live. What do you mean? Jing Yu froze when she heard Xiao Chun's words. She looked at Xiao Chun with a conflicted expression and asked, are you saying that the Emperor wants to silence me? His Majesty won't make a move on the surface, but he definitely won't let His Highness reach the land of exile alive. After all, the journey is so difficult, it's normal for something to happen. Xiao Chun tilted his head and looked at Jing Yu as he spoke calmly. Speaking of which, that's true. Jing Yu fell silent when she heard this. She thought of the 9th Prince, whom she had seen from afar. Didn't he already know what would happen? What's wrong? Xiao Chun looked at Jing Yu's expression, raised his eyebrows slightly and asked, are you feeling regretful? No. Jing Yu shook her head and said, since this person is targeting the Empress and me, what is the reason? I always feel that it's strange. The Empress's flower pot contains medicine that can cause miscarriage, but my flower pot contains poison. Why is that? Someone wants to kill me, and that poison, it's like the style of the Miaojiang people. Jing Yu frowned deeply as she spoke. She turned to look at Xiao Chun and asked, didn't the Miaojiang people evacuate? Why would there be such a thing in this flower pot? Could it be that His Highness colluded with the Miaojiang people? Jing Yu's golden-green eyes flashed with a cold light. I'll have someone investigate this matter. Xiao Chun's eyes were filled with seriousness when he heard Jing Yu's words. Jing Yu nodded and leaned back slightly to relax her body. Xiao Chun looked at Jing Yu's tired appearance, and his eyes were filled with heartache. Chapter 1923. You've worked hard for so long. Have a good rest. Xiao Chun stretched out his hand and stroked Jing Yu's hair as he said, tomorrow, we will leave the palace and return to the prince's residence. There are still some matters waiting for me to take care of at the Emperor's side. I will return later. Amen, Jing Yu replied. It was probably because she knew that Lu Miaoqiu was safe and sound that Jing Yu felt relieved. At this moment, She was so tired that she fell asleep once again. When she woke up again, her stomach was already unbearably hungry. Just as she was about to call for someone to come in, she saw the food that was brought in. "Madam, you're awake?" Yin Xiao walked in and saw that Jingyu had sat up. She immediately went forward to support Jingyu's body. "This is—" Jingyu looked at the food. This was ordered by the Ninth Emperors. He said that Madam would probably wake up at this moment. Thus, he asked us to heat up the food and serve it to Madam when you wake up. He really knows how to calculate. Jingyu laughed involuntarily when she heard that. She tidied up a bit before sitting down at the table. These dishes were really to her taste. Jingyu nodded her head in satisfaction and slowly ate. Xiao Chun hasn't returned yet. After eating a few mouthfuls, Jingyu suddenly stopped and asked. The Ninth Emperors came back for a while. However, Madam was still sleeping at that time. Thus, I did not wake Madam up. After that, the Ninth Emperors left. Yin Xiao said obediently. He should have left because of the matter of the Crown Prince. Looking at the sky now, he should be back soon. Crown Prince. Jingyu was stunned when she heard Yin Xiao's words. Madam has just woken up. Thus, you probably don't know that the Emperor has appointed the prince that the Empress gave birth to as the Crown Prince. He has been given the name Xiao Tianyu. Yin Xiao said respectfully. Xiao Tianyu? That's a good name. Jingyu slowly raised her eyebrows. Her expression did not change much. However, the shock in her heart was incomparable. What was this Xiao Yuling trying to do? At such a critical moment, she directly appointed a newborn child as the crown prince? Was she trying to force Lu Miaoqiu to be unable to leave? Could it be that she wanted to use this child's identity to tie Lu Miaoqiu to her side? Or did she have other intentions? Jingyu furrowed her eyebrows in confusion. However, she was unable to come to a conclusion. After eating and drinking her fill, she lay on the soft bed and waited for Xiao Chun to return. Not long after, Xiao Chun returned. Jingyu also confirmed from Xiao Chun that Xiao Yuling had really appointed a crown prince. Xiao Chun had been busy for the entire day. Jingyu did not ask any questions and went to sleep. When she woke up the next morning, Xiao Chun asked the imperial physician to take her pulse. After confirming that Jingyu was fine, Xiao Chun agreed to return to the residence. When he was preparing to leave the palace, he naturally had to visit Lu Miaoqiu. Seeing that the child was healthy and Lu Miaoqiu had woken up, Jingyu did not stay to disturb them. She followed Xiao Chun out of the palace. Do you think that Xiao Yuling is plotting something again? After seeing Lu Miaoqiu, Jingyu followed Xiao Chun out of the palace. She sat in the carriage and furrowed her eyebrows. She turned to look at Xiao Chun and asked, "No." When Xiao Chun heard Jingyu's words, he knew what Jingyu was worried about. He turned to look at Jingyu and said, "Xiao Yuling is not like what you think. If he was scheming something like this, I would not have helped him in the first place." Chapter 1924. What do you mean by that? When Jingyu heard Xiao Chen's words, she suddenly frowned and asked curiously, "Speaking of which, I haven't asked you before. Why did you choose to help Xiao Yuling and not Xiao Jingran? I think that if you helped Xiao Jingran, it would be a lot easier for you, right?" Jingyu looked at Xiao Chen curiously. "It's very simple." Xiao Chen seemed to have thought of something very interesting. He faintly smiled and said, "Because Xiao Jingran would do anything I asked him to do without hesitation. Because he wanted to please me, he didn't hesitate to give up his bottom line. I don't want to be associated with such a person." Xiao Chen slightly narrowed his eyes and said, "But Xiao Yuling is different. He can promise me some things, but when something crosses his bottom line, he would rather offend me than agree. I admire him for this." Xiao Chun turned his gaze to Jingyu and asked calmly, "Cooperating with a person with a bottom line and cooperating with a person without a bottom line. If it were you, what would you choose?" "I understand." Jingyu faintly smiled and said, "You probably also think that Xiao Yuling is more suitable for that position, right? Or rather, I can get along better with Xiao Yuling." Xiao Chen's lips curled into a faint smile. After Jingyu heard Xiao Chen's words, a faint smile appeared in her eyes. She turned to look at Xiao Chun and said, "This Xiao Yuling is really a mysterious person. Until now, I still don't understand what kind of person he is. In the past, I heard from Yaoqiu that this person is especially good at scheming. At that time, I thought that it would be good for such a person to be the emperor. Jingyu faintly said as she propped up her head. But Jingyu slightly pursed her lips and said again, I have another thought in my heart. I feel that if Miaoqiu were to follow this man, it would be too painful for her. Now that I have experienced so many things, I suddenly feel that Xiao Yuling is a very good person. What? Now, you know, take a good look at Xiao Yuling? When Xiao Chun heard Jingyu's words, he calmly smiled and said, I thought that you only wanted to hear other people's evaluation from Lu Miaoqiu. I am doing this as for Miaoqiu's good. When Jingyu heard Xiao Chen's words, she frowned unhappily and said, But you are right. It is probably because I have too much trust in Miaoqiu that I listen to her. Last time, when Lu Miaoqiu left the Tokyo, it was because of this that you did not want me to pass the news to Xiao Yuling. Xiao Chen looked at Jingyu faintly and asked, Ahem. When Jingyu heard Xiao Chen's words, she immediately coughed and hugged Xiao Chen's arm and said coquettishly, It is my fault. In the future, I will let them deal with their own matters. As for the matter between Xiao Yuling and Lu Miaoqiu, I will not interfere too much. Jingyu looked up at Xiao Chan with a smile and said, I think it is enough for us to deal with it. As for how the others will end up, it is up to them to decide. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.